He should have been dead decades ago. That thought clung to him like a shadow as the hum of the respirator filled the silence of the room. Every breath was mechanical, labored, drawn out as if the machine itself was defying some invisible order of nature. To anyone who walked in, the figure in the chair might have looked frail, almost broken, a body that should have surrendered long ago. But behind those eyes, sharp, restless, refusing to dim, lay something that unsettled even the most rational observer, a mind that moved through the universe like a storm. He waited, motionless, yet not at peace. There was something he knew, something no one else could see. The equations had whispered it to him, half-hidden truths bleeding from the edge of the cosmos. He had written them down, erased them, written them again until the numbers themselves seemed alive, pointing toward a place that should not exist. And though his body was a prison, his mind roamed free, circling that place, testing its walls, pressing against its silence. The doctors had warned him about the disease as if it were a prophecy carved in stone. They told him the muscles would betray him, the voice would vanish, and the end would be quick, merciful in its certainty. But the prophecy had failed. He was still here. And each year that passed only made the silence around those equations heavier, more dangerous. He remembered the first time he had felt it, not in a laboratory, not in the lecture halls of Cambridge, but alone, staring up at the night sky when the city lights had gone dark in a rare blackout. The stars had been violent that night, too sharp, too close. It was then he realized something terrifying. The universe was not indifferent. It was watching. And now, all these years later, he felt that same pressure, the same unshakable presence leaning closer. The world saw him as a scientist, a man of logic and proof. They did not know about the nights when his theories twisted into something far darker, when the chalk scraped across the board like a warning, when even he dared not finish the final line. Something waited at the edge of those unfinished equations. Something patient. His body gave a sudden jolt, the involuntary spasm of a muscle refusing to obey. The machine hissed, steady, loyal, but the air in the room grew colder. He was no longer certain if it was the disease or something else pressing in on him. He knew that if he spoke of it, no one would believe him. They would smile, nod, blame it on the long nights, the exhaustion, the weight of his condition. But he understood. The danger was not in his body's slow collapse. The danger was in the truths he had uncovered, truths that could not be unlearned. He had built his life on the pursuit of knowledge, yet knowledge had become the most perilous weapon in his hands. With each calculation, each new leap forward, the walls of reality seemed thinner, brittle, as if a single question too many would shatter them completely. And now he stood, alone, silent, on that knife's edge, knowing he had already asked the forbidden question. But what had he awoken by daring to answer it? The universe had lied to him. He had spent years believing its laws were constant, unshakable pillars holding the vast machinery of existence in place. Yet the more he probed, the more the numbers betrayed him. They bent in strange directions, split into paradoxes, whispered contradictions he could neither resolve nor ignore. Every attempt to silence them only made them louder, more insistent. And now, staring at the blank screen before him, he knew he had reached a point from which there was no return. The cursor blinked like a pulse, taunting him. Behind it stretched a silence that felt wrong, not empty but filled with pressure, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. He had been here before, hovering on the edge of discovery, but this was different. This was not the clean thrill of unveiling a hidden truth. This was the cold weight of trespass. He was digging in soil not meant to be touched, unearthing something that resisted light. His body betrayed no sign of it. He remained motionless, as he always was, but his mind raced, clashed, collided with itself. Equations spilled like fragments of a dream half-remembered, a sequence of symbols that didn't fit within the boundaries of known physics, patterns that seemed alive, shifting when he wasn't looking. He tried to pin them down, but each attempt dissolved, leaving behind only the sense that something vast was waiting just beyond his grasp. The danger wasn't in misunderstanding. It was in understanding too much. He had tested the theory in silence, refusing to share the full scope even with his closest colleagues. He masked it beneath other work, feeding the world digestible discoveries while keeping the raw, jagged truth hidden in the dark corners of his notes. He told himself it was caution, scientific rigor. But deep down he knew it was fear. Fear of what might happen if anyone else saw what he had seen. Still, the equations clawed at him. They did not let him rest. At night, when the machines hummed around him in steady rhythm, he saw them written in light across the ceiling, reshaping themselves like constellations. They shifted into forms that felt less like mathematics and more like a language, one not meant for him but forced upon him nonetheless. And in those moments, when sleep refused to come, he felt watched. It was never a sound, never a shadow in the room, but something subtler. A presence just beyond the reach of vision, patient and immovable. He tried to reason it away, to cage it in logic, but reason gave him no comfort. If the universe had indeed lied, if its rules were not the unbreakable truths he had always believed, then what else had it hidden? He told himself not to finish the calculation. He swore it. He erased it again and again. But like water pressing against a dam, it found its cracks. The solution formed itself when he wasn't trying, assembled in his mind with the inevitability of gravity pulling a stone to the ground. And when it did, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. The numbers were not a discovery. They were an invitation. But from whom? And to what? The screen blinked again, steady, merciless. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the pull to answer, to accept, to open. They had warned him never to open the file again. The words weren't spoken aloud, of course. No one knew what he was working on. But the warning pulsed through his mind with the same certainty as his heartbeat. Still, the temptation was unbearable. The file was there, locked inside his computer, waiting like a sealed door he had already broken once and could not resist breaking again. His eyes burned as he stared at the dark screen, the reflection of his thin frame trembling faintly in the glow of the standby light. The world outside his window was asleep, but within him raged a storm of unease. The equations had not left him. They had followed him into his dreams, etching themselves onto the walls of his sleep, replaying with obsessive clarity. Every time he closed his eyes, they returned more vivid, more insistent, as though demanding recognition. He knew what reopening the file would mean. It wasn't just numbers and symbols anymore. It was something else, something that resisted being caged on paper. Last time, when he had let the logic unfold unchecked, it was not understanding he had reached but confrontation. The equations had stared back at him. And yet, despite the terror, he was drawn closer. That pull was not curiosity alone. It was compulsion, like the pull of gravity itself. His fingers twitched uselessly against the wheelchair arm, his body refusing him the simplest act of control. The machine that translated his will into words and commands stood ready, waiting for him to make the choice. All it would take was the slightest decision, and the file would open. He hesitated. The silence in the room pressed down heavier than before, dense, suffocating. The hum of the respirator no longer comforted him. It sounded like a countdown. He wondered, just for an instant, if opening the file would accelerate the end he had managed to evade for so long. The cursor blinked. He opened it. The symbols exploded across the screen, raw, unfiltered, alive. They rearranged themselves faster than his eyes could track, reforming into shapes that were both familiar and alien. It was as if the computer itself was no longer displaying his equations but rewriting them, guiding them, reshaping them into something larger than he had ever intended. His breath caught. He knew he hadn't written this, and yet he understood it. That was the true horror. Not that the equations had changed, but that his mind could still follow them, step by step, down a path that seemed to stretch beyond the known universe. Every line carried him deeper, stripping away the fragile comfort of physics as he had known it, replacing it with something older, colder, merciless. He felt watched again. Stronger this time, undeniable. The presence was no longer subtle, no longer patient. It was there, behind him, above him, around him, leaning closer with every new symbol that flared on the screen. The numbers were no longer asking. They were commanding. And in that moment, a single truth carved itself into his thoughts with unbearable clarity. He was no longer the observer of the universe. The universe was observing him. The screen spoke back to him. Not in words, not in any human sense, but in pulses of shifting symbols that moved with an intelligence he could no longer deny. 4 years, numbers had been his allies, obedient, predictable, the loyal servants of logic. Now they rebelled, twisting into shapes that resisted meaning, yet pierced him with understanding all the same. Each sequence struck like a whisper too close to the ear, each equation a command he hadn't agreed to follow. His breath rasped through the machine, too loud, too slow. He wanted to look away, but the screen anchored him. The equations glowed brighter, as though lit from inside, pulsing with rhythm like a heartbeat not his own. The thought struck him with sudden violence. It was alive. And worse, it had noticed him. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, crushing down from all directions. He tried to steady his thoughts, to remind himself that this was his own work, his own mind looping back upon itself. But even as the rational part of him fought, another part, quieter, older, knew the truth. He was no longer in control. Something had shifted since he opened that file. His body, already weak, now felt foreign, as though the disease was no longer the sole force eroding him. The chair creaked faintly under his weight, the respirator hissed and wheezed, and yet all those familiar sounds felt like background noise to a presence that was louder in silence than anything else could be in sound. The cursor moved. He hadn't commanded it. It slid across the screen with deliberate calm, dragging lines of symbols into place, completing patterns he had abandoned long ago. His pulse quickened. If his body still allowed it, he would have broken into sweat. He couldn't deny it now. Whatever this was, it was using him, his mind, his work, bending them into shapes that served not his purpose, but its own. The symbols formed into something circular, an equation wrapped upon itself like a snake eating its tail. He stared at it, and for a brief second, reality itself seemed to flicker. The walls of the room bent at the edges of his vision, the air thickened. His hearing rang with a high, sharp tone that cut through the steady hum of the respirator. Then everything stilled. The circle pulsed once, then faded, leaving behind only the empty white of the screen. But the silence that followed was worse. He knew what had just happened wasn't finished. It was only the beginning. The invitation had been accepted. He tried to summon a line of thought that would ground him, something familiar. Black holes, radiation, entropy. But the concepts wavered in his grasp, corrupted, redefined. The science he had lived by seemed suddenly inadequate, a child's sketch of something vast and terrible. The presence lingered, close, unrelenting. He could not see it, but he felt its gaze, steady and merciless. And in that suffocating stillness, one realization rooted itself so deeply he could not dislodge it. He was not the first to reach this point. The universe answered him. It was not a sound, not a voice he could trace, but something that bled into his thoughts like ink into water. For years he had chased it, convinced that silence was the only response the cosmos could give. Yet now, as the equations throbbed in his mind, he realized the silence had been a lie. The universe had been waiting. The pressure built again, heavier than before, as though the very air wanted to crush him into the chair. The machine hissed to keep him alive, but its rhythm seemed foreign, like it belonged to something else now. His pulse quickened, his thoughts scattered, yet the presence remained steady, deliberate, focused entirely on him. He had touched the hidden structure of reality, and reality had reached back. He wanted to deny it, to frame this within physics, to convince himself he was still in the realm of science. But the neatness of logic had dissolved. The numbers that had once been his tools were now teeth, biting into him, dragging him deeper into a place where reason fractured. Every new pattern carried weight, not the weight of proof, but of command. And still, he could not stop. The circle returned, brighter, larger, unfolding across his screen in layers that expanded like a blooming flower. Each petal revealed another pattern, another impossible truth. His mind followed, helpless to resist, drawn into its symmetry until he felt himself slipping, out of his body, out of the room, into something vast and unending. For one blinding instant, he saw everything. Stars collapsing into themselves, galaxies bending like paper, time unraveling in strands that coiled back into knots. And at the center of it all, a shape without form, a presence without name, waiting with infinite patience. Then the vision snapped shut, leaving him gasping, his body trembling against the limits of its frailty. The file was gone, the screen blank, as if nothing had ever been there. But he knew. He had been shown something not meant for human eyes, and it had left its mark. The danger was no longer theoretical. He stared into the dark, the hum of the respirator the only tether keeping him from drifting into panic. His thoughts spun wildly. Should he share this? Should he warn them? Or was speaking of it the very act that would set it free? He could not know. The universe had given no explanation, only the unmistakable certainty that he had crossed a boundary no one was meant to touch. And as the hours stretched on, one truth hardened in his mind with the weight of inevitability. He had not uncovered a secret. He had opened a door. The presence was no longer waiting beyond it. It was already inside. He realized too late that the door would never close. The thought struck with the force of a revelation and the chill of a sentence. He had convinced himself, even in the hours after the screen went black, that perhaps the universe would recede again into its silence, that what had come alive through the equations might dissolve if ignored. But silence was gone. What he had touched now touched him back, and it would not let go. The machine's hiss grew louder, sharper, as though mocking the frailty that tethered him here. His body was already a cage, his disease a chain. But now, something else pressed into that cage, filling it, crowding him until he felt like a tenant in his own skin. His hands refused him. His voice was gone. Only his mind remained, and even that no longer felt entirely his. The presence was not content to wait anymore. It moved inside his thoughts, slow and deliberate, bending them until he could no longer tell where his ideas ended and its influence began. He tried to recall familiar constants, theorems, the reliable frameworks of science that had carried him all his life. Yet every attempt collapsed, warped, became something unrecognizable. The universe no longer obeyed him. It whispered to him. And the whispers grew darker. They spoke in patterns instead of words, in visions instead of sounds. Stars rupturing like glass. Oceans boiling under skies of fire. A clock winding backward until time itself screamed. The images came not as metaphors but as certainties, as though what he was being shown was not possibility, but inevitability. Still, he resisted. He forced himself to cling to the one truth that had guided him for decades. Nothing was beyond reason. There had to be an answer, a structure, a hidden law. But even as he repeated it, he felt how hollow it had become. Logic was no longer protection. It was the bait that had lured him into the trap. The presence pulsed again, heavy, suffocating. It wanted something. That much was clear. Yet it gave him no words, no terms. Only the pressure, the unrelenting demand that crushed him from all sides. He tried to form the question in his mind, what are you? But the thought dissolved before it was whole. Answers were forbidden. The room itself seemed to tremble, though nothing moved. His body sagged against the chair, the respirator dragging breath after breath into lungs that no longer felt like his own. And beneath it all lay the truth that gnawed deeper than fear. He was not enduring this alone. Somewhere, someone, or something, had walked this path before him. He could feel their absence, the void where they had been erased. The conclusion pressed down with finality, undeniable and merciless. He had not discovered. He had not solved. He had not even survived. He had become a vessel. And the question he dared not ask, what had entered him, loomed larger than the universe itself. He understood, finally, that the danger was not in the universe but in himself. For years he had believed the cosmos was indifferent, that it neither cared nor noticed what fragile beings did in the brief flicker of their existence. That belief had been his shield, his comfort, even when the disease took his strength, even when time pressed down like a weight. But the shield had cracked. Now he saw the truth. The universe noticed. And it noticed through him. The thought was unbearable, and yet it rang with a clarity sharper than any theorem. He had become the equation, the breach, the open wound through which something vast could pass. Every time his mind reached for logic, it found only reflection, patterns folding back upon themselves, dragging him deeper. He was no longer asking questions. The questions were asking him. The machine hissed, steady, mechanical, but each breath felt borrowed. He had lived longer than anyone believed possible, survived beyond every boundary set by doctors and fate. For so long, he told himself it was persistence, stubbornness, the triumph of will over decay. Now he wondered if it had been something else. Had he been kept alive, sustained, not by his own will, but because the presence needed him? I find myself asking, was this inevitable? Was every equation he wrote, every night he stared into the sky, a step closer to this moment? Or did he create it by looking too far, by asking questions that should have remained unspoken? I cannot tell where destiny ends and obsession begins. Perhaps there is no difference. He felt the weight pressing inward, shaping him. It was not death that approached but transformation. A shift from one state to another, like matter collapsing into a black hole. His body had been failing for decades. Now his mind was being unmade, restructured, rewritten. And yet, some part of him resisted, clinging to the thin thread of humanity left in him. But here is the most chilling thought. Maybe resistance was the final mistake. Because if the universe truly wanted him, not his theories, not his discoveries, but him, then struggle only gave it more power. He was the door. And doors do not argue with what passes through them. The cursor blinked again on the screen, though the file was gone. A pulse, steady, waiting. He wanted to scream, to demand meaning, to curse the presence for using him as its vessel. But no scream came. Only silence. Only the hiss of the machine. Only the certainty that he was no longer alone inside his own mind. And as the pressure built, unbearable and final, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. He was not witnessing the universe. The universe was witnessing itself, through him. And I cannot decide whether that is brilliance or doom.